The presidents of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda recently met in Qatar to discuss the ongoing conflict in eastern DRC. Now, they issued a joint call for a ceasefire, which is a significant diplomatic step given the long-standing tensions between the two countries. Now, Rwanda has been accused of backing the M23 rebel group, but they claim that DRC collaborates with the FDLR, a Rwandan rebel group. This meeting in Qatar suggests international mediation is ramping up, but the big question is whether this ceasefire call will lead to real de-escalation or just be another temporary pause. Right about now, I am joined by Nixon Katembo, Analyst, Great Lakes and East Africa from Johannesburg in South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us on The Conversation, Nixon.
Thanks for having me.
The meeting actually took many by surprise, because the two leaders had appeared uncompromising on the conflict, often exchanging barbs in public. Now, were you surprised at this meeting, and do you believe that this particular meeting marks a genuine shift towards peace in Eastern DRC?
I was not surprised, given the fact that both leaders have been here in expressing their views with regard to the conflict in the DRC, not in a genuine manner, but out of pressure or interest thereof in positioning themselves as far as the conflict in the DRC is concerned. You'd recall that the meeting comes after a number of key individuals in the Rwandan armed forces were targeted by sanctions by the European Union, as well as the UK and the United States, as well as some officers and key elements within the M23 rebel. On the other hand, on part of the government of the DRC, with President Tshisekedi and his army losing much of the ground in North and South Kivu to the rebels M23 supported by Rwanda. So it's out of necessity that both leaders are getting together vis-a-vis the negotiations in ending the conflict, but the question is, can it last? And in my own view, that cannot last because there is no sincere political will on the part of both Tshisekedi and the Rwandan president in ending these conflicts.
Well, the big question, just as you said, is can it last? But then the leaders actually stressed that, urgent steps must be taken to halt the bloodshed. Now, in your view, if you could actually tell us what concrete actions are needed on the ground to be able to translate these words into lasting peace?
Mostly this is about political will and sincerity on the side of belligerents to engage in a more genuine approach to search for peace and ending the conflicts. And as far as I'm concerned, this has not been the case on both sides, be it on the part of the government of Kinshasa or the Rwandan government and the M23 themselves, who, by the way, have declared to press on with the fighting against the government as far as taking even the town of Walikale, which by far was still in the government hands. And you would see that their progression on the ground with the rebel advancing. So that shows that there is a lack of political will. And it reminds me of the history of the region in itself. I would recall, if you follow the history of the war in Uganda, for example, that brought Yoweri Museveni into power with the National Resistance Movement, to which General Paul Kagame and many Rwandan officers were part of. They were having a negotiation in Nairobi with the government of Tito Okello at the time. At the same time, the war was continuing in a region, a central region of Uganda called Luwero, and the people were being killed in those areas. The same history repeated itself in 1994, immediately after signing the peace accord in Arusha. as President Habyarimana, accompanied by his Burundian counterpart Silvestre and Tiaramira, returned from Arusha, the war was continuing and their plane was down. And we see the same scenario playing out in Eastern DRC. We're having a very same modus of operandi from the military perspective. And one wonder whether there is a political will. I have some saying that, to me, who have followed closely the events in the Great Lakes region and in East Africa, and particularly with this conflict in the DRC, I have less hope for now.
Okay. Now, Nixon, if you remember, last December, peace talks brokered by Angola collapsed after Rwanda demanded that the DR Congo government talk directly to the M23. And also, we've seen that the rebels actually pulled out on Monday after the European Union announced sanctions on their leadership. Now, I'm asking you this, your personal perspective, your opinion is what we want from this. Do you think that the M23 will heed the ceasefire call?
As I've said earlier, I said that the M23 is already continuing with the war. And regardless of what are the diplomatic pressure that is being exerted, in my own opinion, I don't think that the M23 have that political will and courage to stop the war, in a sense that for now, the Congolese government and these government forces seems to be at a much weaker position when it comes to going to the negotiations. And the M23 have been bolstered by their current position in seizing a large swath of land in the south and the North Kivu provinces. And the imminent sort of a collapse within the government forces in terms of command and control approach are giving the M23 much leverage in pressing on with this war. And therefore, for any reasonable person who closely follow the event in Eastern DRC, who will share my own opinion that the M23 might not necessarily heed the call for peace.
Okay. Now, while we have actually been following, the crisis, we've seen reports indicate that, fighting in the region has actually displaced over 200,000 civilians and also claimed thousands of lives. And critics have actually argued or pointed to figures suggesting that conflict has already cost nearly 5,000 civilian lives. Now, from what you know about this ceasefire, are there or will there be measures in place to address the humanitarian crisis as part of the ceasefire efforts?
As far as I know, and as far as I've been closely monitoring the situation, there is no any approach whatsoever with regard to humanitarian crisis. You remember that the airport of Goma, for example, is closed, as well as the airport of Kavumu in Bukavu, that is in the South Kivu province. Both airports would have been serving as a humanitarian centers to receive much needed humanitarian assistance in that part of the world. The only remaining viable route for humanitarian access would be Rwanda, of which is a country party to the conflict as a belligerent party with the government of the DRC. So when you look at the humanitarian crisis in that country, and I'm saying this knowing the area too well, having been there just in November last year, I understand the carnage that is going on in a part of the Eastern DRC, where, by the way, people are dying of hunger, people are dying of children dying of malnutrition, and other being summarily executed by the M23 rebels and other militia groups, particularly in an area like Goma, Masisi, and Walikale, and a part of Ruchuru. So really, the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding is really something that has not been talked about enough. And unfortunately, we cannot talk UN services because the United Nations headquarters in Eastern DRC were partly in Goma. And much of the United Nations organization and its affiliates were in Goma. Both have left after the capture of Goma by the M23, or they have a minimum services that they have access to. Oh, and some of these carnage are, by the way, happening in the helpless eyes of the United Nations. So it is difficult, even difficult, to say that the humanitarian crisis that is currently unfolding in our eyes in Goma, in Eastern DRC across the board, is being looked at with serious attentions that it deserves from the international community, as well as the government of the DRC and the government belligerent to the conflict in Rwanda.
All right. Now, still speaking on, international organization, you did just say that the UN and other organizations had actually left after the capture of Goma. But in the wake of, these new developments, if you could tell us, how can, institutions like these, that's the UN and also the African Union, play a more assertive role in mediating and monitoring the ceasefire? Because, everything looks positive at the moment.
There are a number of key areas that you have to look at. Diplomacy have to be prioritized over the gun. That is aspect one. The second aspect is look at who are the key belligerents. And I think the sanction regime is slowly touching on that aspect, but not necessarily looking at the core issues and the core participants in this conflict, including the government of Rwanda. The third is around the regional dynamics that have to be looked at. If, say, for instance, the East African community get together in imposing sanction on Rwanda, and in fact, imposing sort of an economic blockade, because Rwanda is a landlocked country, it is dependent on its neighbor for supplies. That conflict will end within a few weeks. I recall, again, from the historical perspective in the Great Lakes region, when Burundi at the time was refusing to negotiate and end the 1993 conflict. What did Nyerere do? Nyerere traveled to Rwanda and spoke to Paul Kagame and the President Bizimungu at the time, that they have no other option but to impose economic sanction on Burundi. And that led to the Burundian to come to the party and discuss the conflict and ended it afterwards. And that sense of political will within the region has not come out clearly, although SADC and East Africa are discussing those matters. But I think there has not been a sincerity in terms of an assertive diplomatic approach to ending this conflict. But on the part of Kinshasa as well, the leadership seemed to be wishy-washy about what kind of approach it needs to take in terms of having those discussions in solving internal problem to the conflict, particularly looking at the grievances that the M23 is putting forward. But also on part of Kigali, what are the grievances that they have against the government of the DRC? The FDLR has always been, but is it the only aspect that the government of Rwanda is looking at? So those are the kind of political dynamics and the diplomatic approach should take in making sure that the conflict is looked at holistically from the regional perspective by international institutions such as the African Union that you have mentioned, and the regional institutions, as well as international bodies such as the United Nations, even though the United Nations in this particular case has been acting as powerless. But then, beyond that, you have to look at the international partner to these countries, such as the United States, the UK, the European Union, as to start acting here and there, and making sure that they leverage their power diplomatically, politically, and economically or otherwise to press the belligerent in the conflict in the DRC to end this endless killing of civilians.
Okay. Now, I'm being told that Alex Vines, Director of Africa Program, Chatham House in South Africa, has actually joined us at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation, Alex.
You're very welcome, and actually I'm in London, not in South Africa, so okay. London, the UK.
Yeah. Apologies for that. All right, so now let's pick up from what Nixon said about, there being no sincerity in diplomatic approach in ending the crisis in the DRC, and also the need for international partners like the US or even the EU, to start acting to end the bloodshed in the DRC. Let's have your thoughts on this. And also, if you could speak to us on, what you think about the mediation efforts of Qatar between Kenya.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I did catch a part of what Nixon was saying that sounded very sensible, and he's got good analysis of what's happening in Eastern Congo. So, as your viewers will know, there were two peace processes, one led by the East African community, the Nairobi process, another by the Southern African Development Community, led by Angola, the Rwanda process. Last month, those two were merged at a summit of the EAC and SADC jointly. The African Union attended the open ceremony, although the chairperson of African Union was excluded from the detailed conversations that occurred there. What was noticeable about that particular summit was that the leader of President Kagame of Rwanda and President Tshisekedi were not there to talk to each other. And there lay a problem that they both haven't met face to face until we saw earlier this week that they both appeared in Qatar to have a conversation together, brokered by the Qatar administration government. President Kagame had been saying that he did not trust continental and regional actors, and that the mediation needed to go out of the continent. He had proposed, in fact, President Erdogan of Turkey, and that didn't land well with Kinshasa. And so the compromise, which did surprise me, I wasn't expecting what happened in Qatar, in Doha, earlier this week, was the conversation between both leaders. We'll see now where that goes. The communique from Qatar, from that meeting, is that the merge processes of the EAC and SADC come together again, and that there need to be more negotiations. We'll see. Given that M23, as you were just highlighting in the strap line, is moving towards Kisangani, it's a good road from where they are now, and it's possible they'll capture Kisangani, which would be a major triumph for the rebel alliance, M23. And they still say that their crosshairs is on Kinshasa and regime change. So I think in the end, the only way through this is through negotiation. M23 itself, again, as your viewers may be aware, were invited earlier this week to Angola for a discussion, and then they pulled out because of EU sanctions on M23 commanders and some Rwandan commanders that are involved in M23. Again, as your viewers probably know, the UN has claimed that there are at least 4,000 Rwandan troops that are supporting the M23 rebellion. So that's where we are at the moment. And where Nixon is right is, how do sanctions play a role in this? Clearly, the ramping up from the EU earlier this week had an impact. There is discussion of a further package of sanctions. And the United States has made a signal that it is interested in a minerals deal in exchange for security, and is discussing there with Mr. Tshisekedi. As all viewers will probably have recognized, the discussion of strategic and critical minerals is something that interests the Trump administration a great deal. Yeah. Look at what's happening on Ukraine at the moment. And the DRC is the richest country in the world for natural resources, including resources that are absolutely world class. 68% of global supply of cobalt comes from the DRC. And so that's something that is a real driver. Again, just reiterating, underlining the point that Nixon made, when you compare that with a country that, I forget the figure, $24 trillion worth of natural resources is the estimate for DRC, compared with tiny Rwanda, that is just the size of some of the smaller states that you have in Nigeria, size of the country of Wales in my own country. I think that begins to tell you something, that the ambition, if it were ever there, to actually capture and change government in Kinshasa is very unlikely. So that's where we are at the moment. And so I hope I've added some detail to the excellent presentation of Nixon.
All right, now, still on you, Alex. Now, international partners, including donor nations, have actually called for a comprehensive, peace plan. Now, in your view, what should the immediate priorities of such plans be?
Well, immediately we need a ceasefire. I mean, it was already a dreadful humanitarian crisis until the Sudan really took off. It was the largest source of internal displacement in the world. I mean, remember, Eastern Congo has 100 armed groups active there. It's an insecure area, and M23 now has kind of, captured the headlines, but there are other armed groups in the area. The crisis this year, with the real uptick of M23 and its captures of Goma, Bukavu, and now moving towards Kisangani, has created, another raft of displacement, 7 million people this year, and at least 7,000 dead from kind of UN figures that I've seen. So we need a ceasefire. That's got to be the first priority, and I'm hoping that international pressure will prevail. I can't see that Rwanda long term could be pursuing, too much further in this. And also Kinshasa is very, very far away, even from Kisangani. But I think there'll be more intense diplomatic mediation efforts now, in that nobody wants to, on the international community side, really wants to see Kisangani fall into the hands of M23 also. So we'll see. Rwanda is a rational player. This is not ideological, and I think the pressure can prevail. When we had an uptick of M23 a decade ago, what Nixon was outlining, a package of sanctions and pressure, did work, and M23 was then stopped, and then it more or less disappeared, and then re-emerged 3 years ago. The third anniversary of its reappearance is next week. So it's a bit like a Frankenstein monster, in my view, that was resurrected and is a lot stronger. I was hearing yesterday that, unlike 10 years ago, M23 is more disciplined, and it is incredibly well equipped with military materiel, including what it's captured from the Congolese government, but also from the SADC peacekeepers and associated Romanian mercenaries and others. So it's a much more efficient fighting machine than it was 10 years ago.
All right, let's hear from Nixon on the same question that I just asked you about. What should be the immediate priorities of the peace plan?
I think it's, at the cost of not repeating what Alex has just said, the peace processes have to be, as I said earlier, very deliberate, with the political will from the players in the conflict. But if you look at the mediation that Alex have mentioned, for example, Qatar, a proposition for Qatar, Qatar is sort of an economic party to the player and is not innocent here. Qatar has signed a deal with Rwanda to extend the airport in Kigali, the Kanombe airport, as well as that of the airport of Bugesera in the south of Rwanda, and also taking over Rwanda Air by 60%, if I'm not mistaken. Qatar has been buying gold, illegal gold mined in Eastern DRC, and refined in Rwanda, some of which were sanctioned just recently. So you see the role of Qatar. At the same time, Qatar was discussing with Kinshasa in modernizing and the construction of about 25 airports within DRC. And to take, for instance, Turkey. Turkey was selling now to the Rwandan army much needed army equipment, including drones and drone jammers, alongside Poland through the likes of Javelin portable surface-to-air missile to the Rwandan government and end up in the hands of the M23. You would recall, if you read the details, by the United Nations group of experts report detailing where the source of arms are and why the M23 is seemingly much more organized and well armed, as Alex said earlier. So I'm mentioning this deliberately just to say that there have to be a sincerity of engagement and the political will, both internal and external. And when I mean external, it's these parties, for example, Qatar being sincere on really what are its economic interests in gathering Paul Kagame and President Tshisekedi in Doha for discussions. But also, why is Kagame insisting on having Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to mediate in the conflict? The answer is there. Even as we speak, the military cooperation between Rwanda Defense Forces and the Turkish army for training, and much of the range specialists, for example, about 150 drone specialists were sent to Turkey to learn exchange from the production of drone in Turkey from the Rwandan Defense Forces. So I'm mentioning all of these examples so to give you a sense of that there has not been enough political will on both sides, both internal and external, to the conflict. And I hope that international sense prevails and people engage with the diplomatic sincerity that the conflict deserves, particularly the humanitarian crisis, one part of the and alleviating the suffering of the people of the DRC, because the people have suffered too long, and this conflict sort of people have turned the blind eyes for economic reasons and many other interests that Alex mentioned, including the geopolitical dynamics that now are coming in the context within the broader sense of geoeconomics, as well as the rare earth and critical mineral resources that my colleague Alex mentioned.
Absolutely, Nixon. When you talked about people having suffered so much, I was actually going to ask the assurances that can be given to local communities that this ceasefire will be more than just a temporary pause in hostilities. But since we do not have time on our side, I will defer the final question to Nixon about his thoughts, and also how you think that this particular meeting in Qatar, would help forge a new roadmap for lasting peace in Eastern DRC.
I think this meeting was just a diplomatic gimmicks, and unfortunately,
no. This particular question is for Alex Nixon. This is for Alex. Sorry about that.
Okay, can you say the question again? Once you mentioned Nixon, I didn't hear it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was asking how you think this particular meeting in Qatar would help forge a new roadmap for lasting peace in the Eastern DRC.
Well, look, the most important thing that Qatar did was bring those two presidents into the same room and looking at each other and talking. So we'll have to now see, as Nixon said, you need to build up trust. There's no military solution to this Congo crisis. There are some certain guarantees based on the history of genocide that occurred in Rwanda that they're also looking for. Although I think the primary incentives of this are actually not about chasing genocide there, but are about economics. So, well, you know, it was not an unpleasant surprise to see that those two gentlemen could be in the same room together, because I wasn't sure about that. And I do think that you will need international mediation and pressure that is outside of the region, because the region, be they SADC or the East African Community, have interests in Congo. The history is that they are trying to pull Congo because of their economic interests, including also building up transport and supply chain corridors to benefit from Congo's resources. So it is going to need outsiders to facilitate this. But as Nixon and myself have alluded to, the difficulty is that Congo is so rich that most outsiders have interest too. And so, you know, how to find some neutrality in mediation is going to be difficult, but really important.
All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your thoughts on this and also for your time. Nixon Katembo, analyst, Great Lakes and East Africa, Johannesburg, calling us from South Africa, and also Alex Vines, Director of Africa Program, Chatham House, all the way from the UK. We appreciate you for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.